In this presentation, we will have an overview of critical realism as a philosophical paradigm. We will also have an overview of its main terminology and its implications as a research paradigm in social sciences. So, critical realism basically is a philosophical approach that helps us in understanding science and reality. This philosophical paradigm was developed by Roy Bhaskar, who was a British philosopher, and he developed this paradigm in the 1970s. Generally, this paradigm is a kind of middle path between positivism and interpretivism. We have presentations on the other paradigms, that is positivism and interpretivism, available on this channel. According to the main conceptions of critical realism, reality is independent of our perceptions or the theories that we have to understand realities and our constructions. But the knowledge that we have of this reality is inevitably mediated by human interpretation. In other words, there is an objective reality, but the knowledge of that reality is contextual and in many cases subjective. As a research paradigm, there is an increasing popularity that critical paradigm has in social sciences, mainly because it helps us in getting in-depth knowledge or understanding of the social phenomena or social situations. And it also is popular because it helps us in explaining, in not just understanding social phenomena, but in explaining social phenomena. Now, the key ontological and epistemological assumptions of critical realism. So, first of all, ontological realism, which actually means that critical realism focuses that reality exists independently of our knowledge. So, whether we know reality or we don't know, reality is still there. This reality could be physical, it could be social, it could be psychological, structures around us. So, in other words, there is an objective reality. Epistemic relativism is another key concept of critical realism. What is that? This actually means that while there is an objective reality that exists independently, but our understanding of it is always fallible and it is theory laden, and so we understand that reality keeping in view our contexts or our ways of knowledge. In other words, knowledge is historically and culturally situated and is not entirely objective. So, subjectivity and contextuality are key concepts of this paradigm. Then, judgmental rationality is another concept of critical realism, which actually means that knowledge is fallible, but it is possible to evaluate and to compare different theories and explanations rationally. So, using our reason to get to knowledge by analyzing various interpretations and theories related to knowledge. Stratified reality is another concept, which actually means that critical realists believe that there is a layered reality with 3 dimensions. For example, empirical, that actually means what we experience directly is empirical. Similarly, actual, which actually means that events that occur whether we observe it or we do not observe it. And the third layer of reality is real, which actually means there are mechanisms and structures that generate events and experiences. So you can see that critical realists look at reality, especially social reality, in a more complex way in order to get to the depth of things or phenomena, to understand it from a more nuanced perspective. Now, what is ontological? Some of the terminology that is being used in the critical realist paradigm include ontological realism, which actually means that the critical realists believe that reality exists independently of our thoughts or perceptions. So here are some examples. For example, in the education context, generally my examples are from the field of education. In education, for example, systematic inequality, like class-based access to quality schools, this is a reality, and it exists whether it is acknowledged or studied or whether we don't acknowledge or study it. So this is ontological realism, where reality exists whether we study it or we know it or we don't know it. So similarly, epistemic relativism, which actually means that our understanding of reality, so reality is there and it exists independent of our perceptions, but our understanding of reality is always partial and it is always socially constructed. So the way we know reality is actually something that is contextual, that is partial, and it generally is not impartial. In other words, there is no view from nowhere. So every view or every perception of reality has some basis, some context. Examples of this, for example, include different stakeholders, for example, teachers, students, and policymakers, may interpret the reasons behind school dropout rates differently. So school dropout rates is a reality, but different stakeholders might interpret these differently, mainly because of their different contexts. So in other words, we can say that reality is shaped by the perspectives, and so there is this epistemic relativism as a concept in critical realism. Now, the next important terminology is judgmental rationality. So again, this is something very close to the previous concept, where we say that no knowledge is absolute. We can still rationally choose between competing explanations based on evidence. So we make judgments rationally. We believe that there is no one answer to any question related to the nature of reality, but still we can rationally make decisions related to the most accurate answers, for example. So here is another example. A school leader might irrationally judge that poor teaching practices, rather than any student background, better explains low test scores based on classroom observations and assessment data. So this is an example of judgmental rationality. Another terminology is stratified reality. This actually means that reality has many layers. Now, we have already mentioned these layers of reality. For example, reality has an empirical layer. So what you observe through your perceptions is empirical reality. Then there is actual reality, which actually means what actually happens, whether you perceive it or not. And then there is a real reality, which actually means that there are underlying structures and mechanisms because of which the actual happens, and that actual is something that then we perceive, and we call that empirical reality. So examples, empirical reality, for example, students score low on tests. Now you observe it, you perceive it. Actual, many students disengage during lessons. So this is the reality behind the low score of tests. So this is the actual reality. And the second layer, and the third layer, the real reality is that hidden mechanisms, for example, outdated curricula or low teacher motivation, might cause disengagement, and that disengagement might cause then low test scores. So here you can see that low test scores is the ultimate reality, empirical reality that we see, but the ultimate reality behind that is the real, you can say, that the hidden mechanisms, which include outdated curricula or teacher motivation, etc., these are the actual causes, and that is why we call these underlying structures and mechanisms that lead to the reality that we perceive. So you can see that reality is a very complex concept that the critical realists present to us. Then there are causal mechanisms, which actually means that deep, often invisible forces that generate observable events. So the events that we generally see, or the things that we see, have deep-rooted, or in many cases, invisible forces behind those. So, for example, a teacher's burnout, which is the causal mechanism, might lead to poor instructional quality, the actual, and low student engagement, the empirical. So again, you can see that the causal mechanism is presenting a kind of layers of reality that the critical realist, as a researcher, will be interested to find out. Retroduction is another terminology or concept used in the critical realism as a philosophy. And here it actually means that we infer, or it is a mode of inference that moves from observed patterns. So we observe something, we hypothesize on the basis of that observation the causes or the mechanisms behind something. For example, what must have been to explain what is. So something has happened. For example, a student in the educational context, a student has misbehaved. That is basically the observed pattern, or misbehaved consistently. So there is this observed pattern, and so the critical realist basically takes this observation to the real causes of it. So for example, after noticing consistent underperformance, which is like the observed pattern among rural students, a researcher might ask, what must be true about their school environment or social context to produce this outcome? So in retroduction, the researcher goes from the outcome or what they have observed or the result to the ultimate causes of that outcome. Open systems. Now, what does this actually mean? That in critical realism, unlike in natural sciences, they believe that social systems are more open, flexible, and with multiple interacting influences. So social phenomena is an outcome of multiple interacting influences and outcomes that are not always predictable. So for example, student success is influenced not only by school factors, but also by family, society, the student's health, and the personal motivation. So this actually means there is more openness on the part of the critical realist to explain, to find explanations for the phenomena that they perceive. And then we have agency and structure. Critical realists basically recognize both individual choices. So what are the choices that individuals, for example, teachers or students make? They call this agency. And those choices are basically not entirely independent according to critical realists, but they are based in broader systematic forces. For example, they are based in the structures, in the social structures in which the individuals actually operate or work. So again, here's an example. A student's decision to leave school, which is the decision is basically the agency that is attributed to the student. But this may be shaped by poverty or cultural expectations. So these are the structures that actually lead to the agency or the decision to leave the school on the part of the student. Abduction is another terminology used in the context of critical realism. What is it? Abduction actually means reinterpreting phenomena using theoretical frameworks. In other words, for example, the phenomena that happens and the critical realist observe those phenomena are reinterpreted or in the light of the analysis that come out of the theoretical frameworks in which the critical realist as a researcher works. So for example, reinterpreting teacher absenteeism, not just as personal negligence, but through the theory of work alienation. So the theory of work alienation is applied to teachers' absenteeism, which is the phenomena that is being observed, And so that phenomena, that is absenteeism, is reinterpreted keeping in view the theoretical framework. Emergence is another terminology used in critical realism. What is emergence? Emergence basically means that new properties or patterns emerge from interactions of simpler elements. So elements actually interact, social elements interact with each other, and that interaction leads to new patterns or new observations or new properties. And these new properties or patterns cannot be fully explained by those elements alone. So here is an example again. A collaborative school culture is basically a pattern that emerges from teacher interactions and administrative leadership and shared values. So teacher interactions, administrative leadership, and shared values, these three phenomena interact together to produce a collaborative school culture, which is like the new property or pattern. And so we cannot reduce to one element. So we can see that collaborative school culture emerges out of at least three interacting patterns or properties. And so this is called emergence in critical realist philosophy. Critical realism is a philosophical paradigm, and as a way of science has certain strengths and certain challenges, or you might say weaknesses. The strengths includes critical realism basically bridges the divide between positivist and interpretivist paradigm. Secondly, it offers a robust explanatory framework for complex social phenomena. So critical realists present social phenomena as a more complex form of reality rather than the simplification that is generally associated with, for example, positivism or interpretivism. And thirdly, the third strength is that critical realism encourages reflexivity, critical thinking, and critical engagement with data, looking at data in more complex ways for more complex interpretations and contextual understanding. And lastly, it recognizes the importance of agency or individual choice, but also the importance of those choices or the impact of those choices on the structures, and also the impact of the structures back on those choices. The challenges that we have, that critical realism faces, is that sometimes it can be philosophically dense and difficult to operationalize. So generally, the scientific theory is to make things simpler, straightforward, and quantified. But critical realists believe in the complexity of social reality. And so that is why even its philosophical bases are dense and difficult to operationalize in a research form or in an empirical sense. Similarly, there is a risk of overemphasizing abstract structures at the expense of lived experiences. So sometimes the experiences might be more mundane than the way in which critical realists make them complex or look at them in more complex ways. And thirdly, some also argue that critical realism is difficult to use methodologically, and so there is, in terms of methodology, there is less clarity. Now, as a research paradigm, the critical realism guides both qualitative and quantitative research. So you can say it's a more pragmatic approach to research, where it provides a philosophical justification for using mixed method generally researches, and it enables researchers to move beyond the mere descriptions to deeper explanations of social phenomena. That is why the research that uses critical realism as a paradigm will focus on causation and not just correlations. It will go deeper into understanding the causes and consequences of social reality and its explanations. Next, it also emphasizes the identification and explanation of underlying structures and mechanisms behind social phenomena. Besides this, critical realism make use of retroduction, which actually means reasoning from observed events to possible underlying causes. So researchers observe things and then they try to find out the causes of those observations or those experiences. And the other very important feature of this type of research following the critical realist paradigm is basically attention to context and complexity of the social phenomena. Now, what are the methodological implications of this paradigm? The methodological implications of this paradigm include that critical realists generally, as a researcher, does not prescribe, or critical realism does not prescribe specific methods, but rather inform the logic of inquiry. In other words, we can say that critical realism believes in the achievement of ends, understanding the reality with all its complexity, rather than the use of one or another method as a means. So the focus is on the ends rather than the means. Generally, critical realism supports case study researches. Why? Because case study explore complex causality in real life settings. And secondly, critical realism also supports mixed method approaches, because mixed methods helps us in combining qualitative insights with quantitative patterns, because again the focus is on the ends of understanding social phenomena rather than on the means, that is one method or another method. And lastly, critical realists believe in theory building and explanations through research. So the critical realism as a research paradigm helps us in developing middle range theories, and those theories explain how and why things happen. And so explanations for the how and why of the social phenomena is one of the focus areas of research methodologies that are informed by critical realism as a research paradigm.